Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we are in round 7 of the 2016 Tata Steel Tournament. Great tournament so far. In round 7, our two competitors, two Dutchmen. White's going to be played by Loek van Wely. We looked at his game in round 5 versus Magnus Carlsen. Had an opportunity to actually win against the champion, playing the white pieces against Magnus Carlsen, but made a fatal error at the end and ended up losing that game. So he's going to try to redeem himself, playing the white pieces against Anish Giri, another Dutchman, the youngest player in the top 30 in the world. Not only that, at 21 years old, but he's number 3 in the world. So extremely talented player, one of those young, bright prodigies that looks to kind of potentially overtake Magnus Carlsen in the future. So we have a exciting game on our hands. We'll go ahead and get started with knight to f3, pawn d5, pawn d4, pawn up here to c4, and then pawn to c6. So getting into one of the Slav variations after pawn here to e3. Giri has two options. He could play the semi-Slav with pawn here to e6, or he could just continue with the normal Slav. And that's what he does. He plays bishop out here to g4. And it's kind of depending on how you want to play. You know, pawn here to e6 is a lot more defensive early on. You block off your light square bishop. You're trying to play defense for the early part of the game and then look for a counterattack. But bishop here to g4 allows you to play a little bit more aggressive, get your light square bishop out. Then you can play pawn e6, but you don't really care because your light square bishop's already developed. Sometimes it can be very difficult for the light square bishop to really get involved for black at all, depending on the opening. So nice little variation, just to play the normal Slav. Pawn here to h3, kicking the bishop back, knight here to c3, and then pawn here to e6. Now, a white plays pawn here to g4, which is very, very aggressive. You can kind of see he's not going to be castling on the queen side because he's kind of exposed here with the queen's gambit. But usually you're going to see bishop here to e2, stopping the pin of the bishop on the knight down here to the queen. So bishop here to e2 makes a lot of sense, getting ready to castle on the king side. You could also just play queen here to c2. All of these are very, very common. But besides for the more aggressive pawn here to g4, and now bishop back here to g6. Now white continues with knight here to e5, knight here to d7, and then pawn up here to h4. I think if you are going to bring your knight up here to e5, you should just go ahead and take this bishop here on g6. Allow him to kind of mess up his king side a little bit, and you now have a bishop pair and he does not. But decides to go ahead and play pawn up here to h4, starting to attack a little bit more on the king side. Pawn takes here on c4, and now knight over here recapturing on c4. And another main reason I don't like just the knight recapturing over here is he really wants his material over here on the king side. That's where his majority of attack is going to be as he's pushing forward pawn here to g4, pawn up here to h4. And now he kind of has to re-maneuver all of his knights back over here to the king side. He could have easily just taken away some of the material that black had and then pushed forward a little bit more. Pawn here to h5. Normally when you see pawn here to h4 from your opponent, if you decide to go ahead and stop that attack, pawn here to h6 is reasonable. But I just recommend always just pushing forward with pawn here to h5. So just keep that in mind as you're always evaluating how you should play if your opponent's pushing forward here. Pawn here to h4 usually just makes sense to play pawn here to h5, stopping that attack. You don't want him all up in your business, pushing forward pawn here to h5, even further beyond that. Pawn here to g5, forcing the knight's move, so knight here to d5. Nice little outpost in the center of the board. Bishop here to g2, trying to control the light square bishop in the center, also attacking the knight here on g5 or d5. So the knight comes back here to b6, pawn up here to b3. Defending both the knight here on c4, but also the square here on a4. Bishop down here to b4. And this is kind of a nuisance, just pinning down this knight right here. White can always castle if he wants to. It seems pretty dangerous because he has no pawns kind of in front of his king. He's kind of pushed forward, so very, very risky. But he can't move his knight now. This bishop's going to be tough to be replaced. He can always just take right here. White's almost forced to bring his bishop up here to d2. He could also bring his queen, but then that's kind of tied down. So, Giri doing a nice job of putting pressure on his opponents. Pawn here to e5, trying to break up the center of the board. Anytime you can put pressure on your opponent. So his double bishop pair is doing a good job of hitting all sides, all different angles. Then just start to kind of explode in the center of the board. That's definitely a good strategy. A pawn up here to a3, and now we start to see an exchange on board. Knight to c4, and then after the pawn takes, then the bishop is going to come back here, still pinning down that knight. And White says, hey, I'm going to go ahead and castle on the king side, and Anish does the same thing, castling on the king side. So White's being super aggressive. Black, although he doesn't have his h-pawn, he still has a pretty safe king side structure over here, while White does not. And so, Black is really going to be looking to open up the center of the board. His aggressive double bishops are going to really start to attack over here on the king side, and really try to punish White for having this exposed king side over here. Loek now pushes forward with c5. So he is doing a good job of gaining space. He's trying to cramp down the position of Black as much as possible. It is fairly easy for Black to still keep the game open. But for right now, White is really pushing forward with his pawns, really trying to open up the game as much as possible. Rook over here to e8, just putting more pressure on the center of the board. You always want your rooks to control the center of the board if possible. Following behind the pawns is always recommended. Now, rook up here to e2 really wants to just play rook here to b1, but there's this subtle little bishop here on g6, which kind of a nuisance, threatening that square down here on b1. So he's going to kind of maneuver just using an extra move to bring his rook over here to b2. Queen here to c7, adding another layer of protection on the pawn here on e5. Now rook here to b2, threatening this pawn here on b7 if this queen were to move. But now the pawn is just going to come here to b6, and we see an exchange on board. And now pawn up here to d5. And Black says, okay, I'm going to allow you to push forward, and I'm going to play pawn here to e4. And pawn e4 is a really nice square. Anytime you can get your pawns pushed past kind of the halfway point and you can still hold on to pressure here, this does a few things. One, it allows yourself to set up for some really nice outpost. If you could ever get his knight here to d3 or f3, this is really nice. But it also kind of separates your opponent's pieces. So this light square bishop, it's not going to be getting involved into the action too much because it's kind of blocked off, and so it separates both of these pieces over here. And Black can just continue to just improve his position, start to put pressure on his opponent. So after pawn to c6, we see the queen recapture. Knight up here to b5, now knight here to e5, both sides trying to get better knight position. Bishop over here taking on a5, and then the rook's going to recapture. A little bit more aggressive for the rook. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the move for the pawn to take here on a5, but wants to kind of increase his advantage with more pressure. So rook taking here on a5, attacking this knight, forcing the knight to kind of move. So the knight comes back here to d4, nice little outpost for this knight. Queen here to d6. Now knight here to e2. And he plays this knight to e2 because he recognizes the next move is going to be knight to d3. And this is a brutal outpost for this knight, really controlling a lot of the back line for White. And so White knows that he is really going to have to play this knight to f4 to kind of stop this knight right here. It's the only real good way that he has to maneuver this. He can't really move his bishop, 3 or 4 times to take this piece right here. And so that's kind of why you saw that maneuvering here to e2 and now up here to f4. Now Anish plays the rook taking down here on a3, so gobbling up some material. Rook up here to b5, queen here to c6, queen over here to b1, starting to put more pressure on the pawn on b6. Now the knight says, okay, I'm going to go ahead and take here on f4. The outpost is definitely not as strong as he has a knight right here that can always take it if he wants to. So decides it's actually better to go ahead and exchange, give his opponent a double pawn here on the f-file, and then kind of open up the door for this pawn on e4 to push forward if he can. Queen back here to a d7, getting ready to come down here to the outpost on g4 if allowed to. Rook takes here on b6, and now the queen comes down here to g4. And you can look at it and say, okay, both sides are fairly equal in material, but really black is kind of destroying this just because he has much more active pieces, and these pawns right here, they have a hard time really defending because they're pushed so forward. This bishop can't really move because it's kind of the only protection that this king has, and so black has a lot more active pieces in the game than white. White really doesn't have a strong attack on the board. This bishop is still doing a nice job, and this rook here on e8, both protecting the pawn here on e4. Rook up here to b8, just trying to get some material off the board. That's fine. Rook takes, the queen takes, and now the king to h7 since it was in check. Now the queen down here to e5, and then rook over here to f3. So both sides have 4 pawns, but black is fairly easily going to be able to just gobble up some of this material because all white has is kind of this queen right here to hold on to it. His rook's not going to ever get involved into the game, and his bishop, as we talked about, really can't move at all. So the pawn's going to come up here to f5. Bishop's going to take. Rook here to e1, trying to do something. Rook here to f4, adding another layer of protection on this pawn. Has both his bishop, rook, and queen all protecting that. Rook over to e3, not doing a ton. Bishop back here to g6. Still protecting that pawn. Queen here to d6, so removing an attacker on the pawn here on e4. But then black's just continuing to just gobble up pieces right here. So queen takes here on h4. The rook swings over here to g3. Rook over here, queen to e5, and then, hey, there's an exchange on board. The rooks come off the board. Now queen here to g4. The king comes up here. Now the bishop to f5. Queen comes up here to e7, king here to g6 to protect the square here on f7. Now queen here to e5, but the queen, as we said, is just kind of hanging out. It's not doing anything. It's not in tandem with his bishop at all. All of a sudden, the queen takes here on g5, and Loek van Wely is forced to resign. Just down too much material. He is, 3 pawns towards the end game is just too much to overcome. So in this particular case, Anish Giri wins the game, so he's kind of catapulted himself. He's in the top 3 of the tournament behind Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana, who are tied for first. He's a point off of them. But a really strong game. He started out the tournament losing, and then has tied a few, and then has won a couple as well. So he's brought himself back into contention. So really excited to see him playing well. Loek van Wely, hometown hero, played in this tournament for so many years, I think 25 times in the past 26 years. But for some reason, past 2 times, just has not worked out against some of these top players in the world, even playing as the white pieces. So he'll look to continue to turn things around in the later half of this tournament. But from here on, exciting. We're kind of halfway through the tournament, so hopefully you guys have enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next round. Thanks for watching.